Well, hi, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to another edition of Breaking News for this Thursday. It is the 15th day of August, 2024. And continuing on what we talked about earlier today, the ceasefire and hostage talks that were held today in Doha, Qatar, are done for the day. However, they will continue tomorrow and possibly even into next week. Now, again, there's so much at stake here, as we have talked about, including the possibility of avoiding a disastrous regional war, which nobody wants. But here's the however. However, as we shall see, the two sides do not seem to be able to come to some agreement unless they completely compromise their goals. Will either of them do it? Well, that remains to be seen. Let's look at the headlines. First story is from Virtual Jerusalem. This just came across the wire the last hour, and the headline is Last Ditch Push for Ceasefire Deal in Doha. Israel, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar have resumed intensive ceasefire negotiations in Doha. However, Hamas, the primary belligerent in the conflict, has chosen not to participate in this round of talks, citing objections to Israel's latest conditions. These discussions are particularly critical as they aim not only to halt hostilities, but also to address the issue of hostages and prisoners, a key sticking point in previous negotiations. Now, the absence of Hamas from the talks reflects their dissatisfaction with Israel's proposed conditions. Hamas has indicated that it prefers to work within the framework suggested by lame duck U.S. President Joe Biden rather than entering fresh negotiations with Israel's latest demands. In fact, Hamas has suggested that they might rejoin the discussion early next week if the mediators reach an acceptable plan. Now, on the Israeli side, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, is closely monitoring the talks from Jerusalem, where he has reportedly given negotiators more leeway to reach a deal. But he insists on at least 33 live hostages in the first round of the deal, and also ways to ensure that Israel retains control over the northern and southern sides of the Strip, with movement controls in the middle. The absence of Hamas from the talks, of course, casts doubt upon the prospects for success in the negotiations, and some observers fear that without Hamas's participation, any agreement may lack the necessary buy-in from all sides to be sustainable. So, as the article states, the situation remains fluid, with Israel's Security Cabinet expected to convene later tonight to evaluate the latest developments from Doha and decide on further steps. The international community, particularly the United States and Egypt, is pressing for an agreement to prevent further escalation, especially with the looming threat of Iranian retaliation over the conflict. The talks are seen as a last-ditch effort to avoid a broader regional conflict, but the path to a durable ceasefire remains fraught with challenges, and both sides hold firm to their demands. Negotiations are likely to extend beyond the scheduled two-day session, with all parties aware that time is running out to prevent the conflict from spiraling out of control. Again, that's from Virtual Jerusalem. It came out about an hour ago. And summarizing what went on today, they are going to meet tomorrow, maybe even into next week. And there's, boy, the really heavy, tremendous things that are, that are being discussed here, because the results of what happens could lead to ceasefire, could lead to the stoppage of hostilities, or the lack of an agreement might likely, very likely, would lead to a regional war. So again, the stakes are very, very high. Now, our next two headlines are going to explain the different perspectives that the U.S. and others hold compared to that of Israel. And this first headline is going to develop a story that we briefly mentioned today in our earlier edition of Breaking News. Now, this time comes from the Times of Israel. The breaking news story was just a little blurb from Ynet, and it's the same story, but this time it's developed here by the Times of Israel. And it is this: U.S. said to believe the Israeli Defense Force can't make further gains against a diminished Hamas in Gaza. And that's the story that we did earlier. We just mentioned that. But now the Times of Israel goes into quite a bit of explanation with it, and we'll summarize what they've said. Current and former officials say military achievements have exceeded original expectations, but the only way to free the hostages remains an agreement with Hamas. Israel has achieved all it can in its military campaign against Hamas in Gaza, several U.S. officials told the leftist New York Times in an article published Thursday, saying that the Israeli Defense Forces would never be able to completely eradicate the terror group. The report, citing current and former U.S. and Israeli leftist officials, said the only deal not only a deal, not military pressure, can secure the release of the remaining 115 or so living and dead captives in Gaza who were abducted on October 7th. Still, the report said Israel's Gaza offensive has achieved far more against Hamas than U.S. officials had predicted last October. In fact, General Joseph A. L. Voltel, the former head of the U.S. CENTCOM, told the New York Times that Hamas has been diminished. Now, responding to the Times, the Israeli Defense Force said the IDF and its commanders are committed to achieving the goals of the war to dismantle Hamas and bring home our hostages, and will continue to operate with determination to achieve them. The sentiments cited in the Times also correlate, of course, with leftist U.S. President lame duck Joe Biden's message when he publicly presented the Israeli offer, was actually the Biden offer, in a May 31st speech. He argued that at this point, Hamas no longer is capable of carrying out another October 7th, and warned against the quagmire posed by indefinite war in pursuit of an unidentified notion of total victory. According to the newspaper, Hamas is so hobbled that it would cede civilian control of Gaza after a ceasefire as part of the deal. All right, the U.S. criticism of Israel reflects a long-running disagreement between the U.S. and Israeli militaries on the best way to deal with Hamas. Yaakov Amidor, a former national security advisor and IDF major general, disagreed with the New York Times article, telling the newspaper that Israel still has gains to make in Gaza. If Israel evacuates its forces now, within a year, Hamas will be strong again, he said, adding that the military needs another 2 or 3 months in Gaza's south and center before shifting to year-long intelligence-based raids and strikes to stamp out the terror group's remains. Now, the New York Times article sums up the assessment of the leftist Biden administration as printed in their leftist newspaper, which has historically been anti-Israel. So we're not surprised by this. Now, they are asserting that the fighting should be over now. But for another perspective, note the following article. Okay, this comes from Joel Rosenberg's All Israel News, and it's really a fascinating article. Basically, it says the IDF has its boot on Hamas's throat, but Washington is its biggest barrier to success, warns former British Army officer, and we concur 1,000% with this. Here's what it says. Again, we're summarizing this article from All Israel News. Israel is fighting an unconventional urban war under immense Western pressure. In a recent article in Tablet magazine, former British Army officer Andrew Fox argued that contrary to the assessment of many in the West, the IDF is winning the war against Hamas and needs to be allowed to finish the job. Fox began by acknowledging the accepted political and media analysis in the West that says the IDF is bogged down in Gaza and barely has anything to show for its efforts over the past 10 months. The New York Times published a story, which we just talked about, echoing these sentiments within days after Fox's piece. Israel is not winning. Hamas remains intact. The Israeli government has no plan. The very notion of military victory is illusory. These are the slogans used to characterize the war, according to Fox. He specifically called out a recent CNN analysis, which argued that only 3 out of Hamas's original 24 battalions are destroyed. However, Fox argued that the West has misunderstood how the IDF is fighting the war. The IDF's way of war is not the West's way of the war. It was not designed to carry out protracted campaigns of attrition. It's a raiding army, he contended. He then proceeded to identify several goals and operational phases of the war to argue for why he believes the IDF, in fact, is achieving its goals. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, operational goals are meant to dismantle Hamas's military and administrative capabilities and ensure that Gaza cannot be used to harm Israel again and to rescue the hostages. Now, interestingly, he wrote that the IDF is currently focusing on the extensive network of underground tunnels in Gaza and eliminating key leadership in the Hamas organization. This operation involves ground raids and airstrikes, and Israel's leadership expects, and get this, to take between 6 to 18 more months. The current conflict is an urban war against a well-organized terror army relying on a strategy of human shields and embedding within the population, he wrote, which is distinct from Western conflicts in such places as Iraq and Afghanistan. He noted that the IDF faces significant challenges due to Hamas's use of civilian infrastructure as human shields, as we've talked about, and the West doesn't seem to care about that or mention that, and international pressure on Israel to minimize civilian casualties, which they have gone above and beyond the call of duty to do that. Despite these difficulties, Fox argued that the IDF has made significant progress, including the elimination of approximately 17,000 Hamas operatives, taking out multiple high-level commanders, and seizing control of key areas like the Philadelphia corridor. These actions have led to improved operational freedom and disrupted Hamas's command structure. However, says the ongoing international demand for a ceasefire are detrimental to Israel's goals, potentially, and here's the key, potentially allowing Hamas to survive and influence the outcome of the war. He further noted that Western governments consistently target their criticism at Israel, despite Hamas's repeated human rights and war crimes violations. The Israeli government is under intense pressure from Washington and other Western nations to stop pressing on militarily and to only engage in diplomatic efforts. Now, his assessment is the IDF is only about midway through this complicated strategy. However, they're moving more quickly with more significant results and fewer civilian casualties than any other military would. Now, here's his conclusion. The only thing that can snatch defeat from the jaws of victory and ensure the survival of the Iranian-based Palestinian terrorist group on Israel's border is Washington. Now, do you get that? Very clear. It's Washington. It's Joe Biden that's keeping Israel from succeeding, from winning the war, which they need to win. Otherwise, like we read in the previous article, in about a year, this could happen all over again. Hamas will regroup. They'll come back and do another October 7th. And so that is something that we can't allow to see that from Israel's perspective. All right, so here's the bottom line. We would concur with Fox's assessment. Biden and the Democrats want to get this story off the headlines because of the soon election that's upcoming, and they would love to be able to brag about bringing some peace to the region. However, as the last article states, there's still work to do if Israel is going to achieve victory. This article we just read, lest we forget, Israel was attacked by this murderous terrorist group and needs to make certain that such an event will not happen again from Gaza. Now, here's the key. Again, we want to emphasize that we are watching a story for which we know how all things will eventually end. Remember, the last chapter of the book, the last scene in the movie, is given to us, the last act in the play, however, whatever analogy you want to use, it's given to us by the Bible, what will happen to Israel, how they will end up, the various nations will end up, and what will end up on our planet with the Lord Jesus Christ returning. And so what do we know? We know Israel will still exist. We know the U.S. will become a non-player in world events. Iran will not be a leader in the major military attack against Israel at the time of the end. Instead, that will be Russia, and whatever problems Israel now has on its northern border with Hezbollah will eventually be eliminated, because the time the Ezekiel 38-39 invasion rolls around, they are in a time of perceived peace, which is totally opposite of what they have now. And so they are not expecting the invasion that will take place. It catches them by surprise. So that what we know is eventually going to happen. But what we don't know is when it's going to happen, how long it's going to take, what will be the circumstances, and what's going to happen in the meantime. Nobody knows. So what we do is, again, like we said earlier, is reflect upon the eventual outcome. The Christians win because we're in Jesus Christ. He's coming back. He's going to set up his kingdom. The God of the Bible has already told us what's going to take place. And as we continue to emphasize here, we've written a book called 25 Signs We're Near the End. It's one of the many free books we have, 65 free books on our website, Educating Our World. Now, this one, under the heading of Bible prophecy, along with 11 others, lists, again, 70 specific things in the 25 signs we're near the end that are going to happen at the time of the end. 70 things that have already been fulfilled. Right now, they're already in place. And there's another 30 predictions in these 25 signs that are in the process of being fulfilled, telling us what? That the God of the Bible has told us the outcome ahead of time, miraculously. He's in total control, and he's letting us know so we will not be fearful. As Jesus told his disciples, I'm telling you these things ahead of time, John 16. So when they happen, you won't lose faith. And so we know how it's eventually going to turn out. Now, in the meantime, like we said, there's so many different scenarios, and we have no idea which one will take place. But we know how the game's going to end, and that's the key for us. And so we ought to be optimistic. We ought to be encouraged. We ought to be thankful. and we ought to do our job, and that's to be salt and light to the world and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to a lost and dying world. That's what we do here on Breaking News. That's what our website, Educating Our World, is for, to educate the world with what biblical Christianity is all about. These free resources, we'd love to have you take advantage of them and study just more than the subject of Bible prophecy, but things such as the reliability of Scripture, the person of Christ, the nature of God, the afterlife. There's so many things to study that God has revealed to us. Let's get to know God more personally, and let's get to know exactly what he says about us and about what's going to happen for time and eternity. All right, I'm Don Stewart. That's the latest on this edition of Breaking News. Unless something happens, it seems like there'll be at least a little pause now before a war does break out. If it does, we'll be with you tomorrow morning with the latest. Until then, as always, may the Lord richly, richly bless you.